Welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. This is part 3 of Lecture 6 on ethics. Way back in Module 1, Bertrand Russell mapped the uncertain as the territory of philosophy. Questions that aren't just difficult, but that might genuinely be impossible to answer. Certainty belongs to science, and the march of science, as Cahn noted in Module 3, has represented the progressive and systematic disenchantment of the world. Hume banished meaningful connections from our objective observations, and all that's left is scattered atoms floating in a vast and empty void. In the 20th century, the logical positivists followed Hume's project to its natural conclusion. Any statement that didn't refer to observable evidence is strictly meaningless. The problems of ethics, metaphysics, and religion aren't real problems because they don't refer to real things. They're simply examples of the sloppy and imprecise use of language. So, there's a formula for this that subtracts ethical meaning from the universe, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it originates in Hume. It's known as Hume's guillotine. He's got a fork and he's got a guillotine. And in its most direct form, it simply states that you can't get an ought from an is. That is, there is nothing in our observations of how the world is that tell us anything about how the world should be. Julia Driver makes this explicit by clarifying the difference between descriptive claims and normative claims. So a descriptive claim simply states an objective fact about the world. Noting that dropping bombs on a civilian area will cause mass casualties is a descriptive claim. Normative claims, on the other hand, are statements about how the world should be. Noting that we shouldn't drop bombs on civilian areas because causing mass casualties is immoral is a normative claim. So Hume's guillotine, what it does is it severs the normative from the descriptive, by pointing out that there is nothing contained in the description that logically implies any natural moral evaluation. There's a gap that exists between the world and our moral evaluations of the world. And it's not clear where the justification for our moral evaluations is coming from, if not the world. Put another way, we can't read the moral off of the natural. We judge that killing is wrong, right? But predators kill prey in the wild all the time. If a black hole swallows a galaxy that's teeming with intelligent life, we don't generally put the black hole on trial for genocide. Nature seems relatively indifferent to our moral opinions. For the same reasons, we can't reverse engineer the moral by studying nature. That something is natural does not make it moral. This is a logical fallacy known as the naturalistic fallacy. To argue that something is immoral because it isn't natural is to ignore the casual indifference that nature displays to our moral intuitions. Hume's guillotine severs that link completely. The moral and the natural come apart at the seams. You can't get an ought from an is. So the position that ethical talk is ultimately meaningless, or at least purely subjective or sentimental, is known as moral anti-realism. Contemporary ethics is largely defined by the debate between moral realists on the one hand and moral anti-realists on the other. In parts 1 and 2 of this lecture, we looked at various strategies available to the moral realist. In this lecture, we're going to hand the microphone over to the moral skeptics. See what they have to say. So James Rachel's, in our readings, is going to take a look at probably the most cynical form of moral anti-realism. When we think of our actions as moral, what we really mean is that they effectively served our self-interest. The feeling of having acted morally, the satisfaction and validation that it provides, the resulting self-reflective view of ourselves as moral beings All of these are essentially reward mechanisms, right? We're not being genuinely selfless when we act morally. We're chasing dopamine. We're seeking the reward of the feeling of personal satisfaction that comes from our belief that we are good people. All good deeds have their foundation in personal self-interest, and it's pure sentimentalism to think otherwise. Now, Rachel calls this position psychological egoism, but there's also a stronger form that he identifies, that not only are all good deeds ultimately grounded in self-interest, but they ought to be. We ought to both accept and embrace this. We should, like Ayn Rand in The Virtue of Selfishness, recognize self-interest as the ultimate fountainhead of all virtues. Rachel's refers to this version as ethical egoism as opposed to psychological egoism. Now he's going to mount some arguments against these two positions. Against psychological egoism, Rachel's is going to argue for the existence of genuine altruism and genuine selflessness. And here's how he's going to do that. Arguments for psychological egoism put the cart before the horse, so to speak. We don't help people because it makes us feel good. We feel good because we helped someone. And that good feeling is actually evidence that we're the sort of person who wants to help people. We wouldn't feel good if we didn't want to help people. The reward doesn't exist prior to the moral intuition. The reward exists because of the moral intuition. Therefore, genuine altruism exists. Ethical egoism, on the other hand, faces a sort of performative contradiction. In its most straightforward form, the position reduces morality to a series of strategic maneuvers where other people are sort of pawns for achieving our self-serving goals, right? It's manipulative. But if that's true, then it's against the interest of the ethical egoist to make the case for ethical egoism. Because the strategy only pays out if you're the only person acting out of self-interest. If everybody is acting out of self-interest, you're just as likely to be the mark as you are to be the con. So maybe that doesn't work. So another possibility is discussed by Julia Driver, and it's that morality is subjective. Now, we've talked about the distinction between objective and subjective facts within the context of Thomas Nagel and his framework of the first person sort of inside view versus the third person objective view. Driver's going to give us another way of interpreting this objective-subjective distinction. A fact is objective when it remains the same regardless of whether or not you believe in it. So that which doesn't go away when you stop believing in it is the objective. Subjective facts are the opposite. They vary from person to person. So the moral subjectivist argues that moral facts are subjective in this way. Saying that something is moral simply expresses a personal preference rather than any binding objective obligation. And when you say something is moral, you're just saying, I like this. So against this view, Driver is going to argue that it's ultimately self-defeating. For a couple of reasons. First, it makes moral disagreement incoherent. If there is no external fact of the matter, only differing preferences, then there's no way to evaluate between them. The person arguing that torture is wrong and the person arguing that actually torture is perfectly fine are both just expressing differences in personal taste. You know, this person finds torture distasteful and this person finds it, whatever. Disagreements about moral facts reduce to disagreements about moral attitudes. And since both parties are accurately reporting their preferences, there's no coherent sense in which either party can be wrong. Even if they're arguing completely opposite positions, they're both correctly describing their preferences, so nobody's wrong. And this kind of highlights a second problem for Driver with moral subjectivism. We generally like to think of things like torture and genocide as wrong whether or not someone agrees with them, right? If you want to know the moral status of murder, it seems like a bad strategy to ask a serial killer. That's not the person who's going to give you a good read on things. The subjectivist is ultimately forced to acknowledge that moral atrocities can be justified if they are committed by someone who doesn't find them distasteful or unpleasant. And this conclusion seems to contradict every moral intuition that we possess. Okay, so these hardline versions of moral egoism and moral subjectivism that Rachels and Driver are criticizing are relatively fringe positions in contemporary philosophy. There's a stronger version of subjectivism, arguably called expressivism, but I'm not going to get into that here. Mary Midgley, on the other hand, is going to mount a more subtle and challenging solution to a very real, very live, very politically charged issue within modern ethics. And that's the notion that there are independent moral standards that can be used to objectively compare one culture against another. We're caught, in Midgley's view, between two equally unappealing extremes, right? On the one hand, there is a long history of groups and nations appealing to culturally transcendent morals in order to justify the occupation, colonization, enslavement, and eradication of other groups. The appeal to culturally transcendent morality is the worm at the core of every genocide. The Crusades, the eradication, having trouble with that word today, the eradication of indigenous peoples, and the Holocaust were all campaigns driven by absolute certainty of the moral correctness of one culture over another. At the other extreme is what Midgley calls moral isolationism. This is an extreme form of moral relativism that argues for a strong incommensurability between cultures. Now, recall from back in module 2, back in lecture 2, we briefly discussed Thomas Kuhn and paradigm incommensurability, that if two paradigms are incommensurable, if they are so different that they share no common vocabulary that would allow them to communicate successfully, can't even talk to each other. They don't share common terms. The moral isolationist, according to Midgley, generalizes this insight to culture. So we cannot, by definition, step outside of our own culture and into some neutral standpoint from which we can objectively evaluate another culture, just the cultural version of Nagel's view from nowhere. But Midgley is going to argue that this is too strong. The moral isolationist picture is too strong. First, there's an asymmetry. We're reluctant to blame other cultures because we worry that we're imposing our values upon them without justification or consent. But we typically don't have similar worries about praising other cultures, right? It's fine to point out the things that we admire, but sort of suspicious to point out the things that we don't admire. But this is sort of inconsistent, right? The holding of different standards of evaluations implies that what we're really concerned about is taking a controversial stance in a potentially uncomfortable discussion. This looks like moral cowardice, masquerading as epistemic humility. In fact, holding a consistent version of moral isolationism, according to Midgley, is literally impossible because the incommensurability thesis is actually false. Every culture that exists has absorbed, selected, evaluated, and rejected a multitude of moral intuitions from a wide variety of other cultures. There is no such thing as a pure moral culture. The very practices that we praise in other cultures have emerged through the ongoing and inevitable negotiations, moral and otherwise, between civilizations, groups, nations, and peoples. This cosmopolitanism, it's not a vice, it's a virtue. We understand our own values in comparison to other cultures, and we develop empathy through understanding. And we advance in morals, as in every other venture, by having access to a greater variety of choices and alternatives. Hermetically sealing cultures off from one another out of fear of causing offense results in the perverse outcome of producing insular, xenophobic societies who can hear and comprehend no voices but their own. And that's what Midgley's concerned about there. So while Rachel's Driver and Midgley are considering arguments about whether morality is even possible, Susan Wolf is going to come at this from a different angle. And it's very interesting. It's a very influential argument. Wolf is going to ask whether we should actually want to achieve something like moral perfection, whether it's moral to seek moral perfection. She's shifting into an explicitly meta-ethical register here. She's going to ask if becoming a moral saint is itself a moral value. Do we actually want to inhabit a world of utilitarian moral calculators or Kantian rational lawgivers? Wolf is going to describe two archetypes of what she calls the moral saint. There's the loving saint, and this is the utilitarian ideal. Excuse me. The loving saint would invariably prioritize the happiness of others over their own personal interest. On the other hand, there's the rational saint. This is the Kantian ideal. The rational saint would abandon all personal desires in service of their higher moral duty. In either scenario, the moral saint would live an ultimately impoverished life. They would have little time for hobbies like reading or art unless they could demonstrate that these were somehow measurably improving the world. There'd be no sarcastic humor, that would be out, could potentially hurt someone's feelings and increase the overall unhappiness in the world by some minute quantity. Can't have that. Any hobbies or interests would need to be weighed, measured, and calculated for their moral value before you engaged in them. The moral saint, whether utilitarian or Kantian, would, in other words, be a very boring person to either be or to be around. A world of moral saints would be an impoverished world. Drab, colorless, humorless, and small. Life is ripe with goods beyond the moral. Aesthetics, creativity, personal development, relationships. Could we sacrifice all of these in the single-minded pursuit of moral perfection? Philosophical ethics kind of tends towards totalization and the subordination of every other practice under some strict set of moral requirements. But maybe morality should play a more limited role. Maybe a fulfilling life requires making space for ways of being in the world that aren't measured by their moral value. This isn't a license to engage in arbitrary immorality. An acknowledgement that we're more complicated animals than any ethical maxim can fully describe. And that seems like a good place to stop for this module. Our next and final lecture will broaden the ethical lens to consider the concept of justice at the social scale. And I'll see you there.